Hello, fellow Dreamcatchers. We are back in the Haven to discuss another wonderfully written book by one of my personal favorite authors, Sandra Manigault. Sandra has penned her third novel, Flora, Saga, which is book 3 in the Vanessa Trilogy. My Dreamcatchers may remember Sandra joining us in the Haven in seasons 1 and 3 when we first were introduced to the delicious characters encompassed in this trilogy. And you're probably very happy to hear that there's a third offering. So without further ado, let's welcome Sandra back to the Haven. Welcome back.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
It is so good to have you
Thank
back.
you.
And
Thank you.
you know, I don't know if you remember, you probably do. When you were here, season 1, and probably in season 3 when you were talking about those books, I knew that you would be back, but I felt that you weren't really sure what that third book was going to be about, or what, you know, how it was going to take form, at least at the time that we taped it. So let's do a deep dive into these characters and to your whole writer's game. Talk to me about Flora Saga.
Okay. Flora Saga is interesting. I wasn't planning to even do a sequel to Vanessa Love Story. And I remember one or two women saying to me, "You can't stop here. I want to know what's going to happen to her."
Yeah.
Because after all, love stories are supposed to end a certain way, and mine didn't. So there was the sequel. And honestly, Valerie, when I was first writing the sequel, I had to ask myself, wow, something seems different.
And
Is
to be
this
clear,
Yeah.
you're talking about
Yeah,
this
book 2.
Book 2.
Yeah, I honestly had to ask myself, is this the same Vanessa who was in book 1? Because it was as if she was different. And it took me a while to kind of get my head around the fact that it's the same Vanessa, she's just grown up some. And the way she interacts with men's a little different now. She's not going to do in book 2 what she did in book 1.
Right.
You know, get swallowed up by the sky. You know?
Yeah, and I think that is what is so interesting about your characters overall. Not just Vanessa, but just their development as people, as women, through their experiences in the book. And we just kind of trail along with them. And that's why, you know, people are like, when is the next book coming? When is the next book coming? People contacting me, when is she coming up? Because they know when you're coming on, it's because you have a new book. So how did you finally get to a place to write with a level of authenticity with regard to the character?
I'm not sure. But you know, one of the things I do, I don't follow the rules. And when I hear about other authors, you know, you need a story arc, you need an outline, you need to know how the book is going to end before you start. I don't know what they're talking about, and I don't do it. And when I get in workshops or sessions with women who abide by the rules and they're trying to do what the experts say they should do, I can't stay, because that's not how I write. And I figure if I try to write like that, I'm going to get all messed up. So I don't do it.
Yeah, there really is no set in stone process of writing, because all of us are inspired in different ways. Our process is different. You know, that the pansters do it a certain way, whereas the plotters like myself, you know, looking at how a pantster writes would drive me nuts. But in my plotting of how I'm going to put the story together, there is a level of pansters that's going on, because you have to be willing to listen to the characters.
You do.
And they may take you in other directions that you may not have plotted them to go, but that's where the authenticity.
Well, the interesting thing about the process is that I don't know how the plotters can plot knowing what the characters are going to do if the characters are telling the story. How do you know?
Well, you're plotting based on what the characters are telling you. You're just a scribe.
Yes, but if you're a scribe, you're listening to them as their story unfolds. So how do you, on page 35, know what's going to happen by page 110? Hasn't happened yet. And they've got to live through that. They've got to get from where they are on page 35 to where they're going to be at a page 110. And how do you know? Because they don't know who they're going to meet and how they're going to interact with who they're going to meet and what's going to happen and how they're going to react. So you literally are letting them tell the story, and you're listening to them tell the story.
Yeah.
And it sounds really bizarre, but that's what happens. But that's not the only thing you do. I think about one of my editors, the best of my editors, who is a wonderful person. I wish I could kind of like live joined to the hip with her, and then we could really get some stuff done. And I remember, for example, in Flora Saga, the first thing she said to me about one of the characters, very early on, she said, "He's not ready." And I thought to myself, no, because his story is unfolding and he's talking and interacting with Flora, but I didn't realize he wasn't ready, but she could see that in his conversation. And then later on in the book, when there is another character introduced, I didn't know how to get them where I needed them to be. And she said, "Why don't you let such and such happen?" And I said, "Oh no, I don't want that to happen." And then I thought about it. And I said, "Okay, I will." But then I had to figure out the how of it. And you see, I'm trying not to tell you too much, but do you want to know?
Sure. Our audience probably wants to know.
Oh, I don't know if I want them to know. I don't mind you knowing.
Oh,
but
okay.
It's okay, okay. Okay, well, I'll give you a little hint. She says, "What if he has an accident?" And I really didn't want him to have an accident because I didn't want anything to happen to him.
You're fighting with the, well, okay.
I'm fighting with the advice.
Yes. Not necessarily what the character's
But then in
telling
terms of how it was going to happen and when it was going to happen,
Yeah.
it was perfect timing. So it happened. And it actually brought the characters closer together.
So it happened organically
Yes.
versus being forced
yeah.
and,
Oh, yeah.
and all of that. And then that's always
No.
the best
No, I
way.
really listen to them. And I think one of the things, you know, I think when you're a writer, I think it's a gift, particularly if you can write authentically and write fast, and I think I do. But the other piece of it is you want the characters to tell the story, which means you've got to be good at dialogue. And I think that's a gift, and I'm very grateful for that gift. And so as the characters are telling the story, they're growing, and you can see things develop. And I think one thing about process, I find when I'm writing, particularly when I'm almost done with the first draft of a book, I'm constantly reading it through again, over and over and over, because a lot is going on, and I just want to make sure that the relationship that's being developed is authentic,
right to the character,
is believable, and is true to the characters. So, did I ever answer the first question?
that's what
Yeah.
you feel has come
Yeah.
across in Flora Saga.
Oh, definitely.
And definitely in your other two
Yeah.
earlier books.
Yeah.
So why did you decide to focus on Flora?
Well, you know, she shows up in book 1, and we know that she's Vanessa's best friend in book 1, and she really helps Vanessa keep it together, because Vanessa's kind of all over the place.
I love Flora's personality.
Yes, and she is so down to earth. She's direct, she's strong, and she's a beautiful person inside and out. And so it's just important. She's pivotal in that first book, and she's there more than once in that first book. In the second book, what happens is she is more of a dominant character. Vanessa is still primary, but Flora is there, and Flora forms a relationship of her own probably about midway through, and that relationship grows. And so we know Vanessa has a wonderful ending in book 2, and Flora is really just getting started in her relationship.
So
And
it's
I
kind
just
of a
felt-
handing off of the baton, so to speak.
Kind of. But I also think Flora deserved her own platform. She deserved her own story, because we want to know, well, is she successful? Is this relationship going to work? And so it starts in book 2, and it continues. She becomes primary in book 3. But you know, one of the other things I've noticed, a number of authors write, I'm not going to say they write necessarily what I would call legacy novels, but they keep going from one generation to the next to the next. I don't
Of the
think
same characters?
No, of a family. a family of characters. At least there was one series I read like that. And I thought, this is interesting. And I didn't want to do that, because that requires plotting. Okay. But I did want there to be some continual development. And so you have a certain body of characters in book 1. You carry some of them over in book 2. You add characters in book 2. You carry some of those over into book 3. But also I brought back somebody, a couple of people at least, from book 1 we see again in book 3. So you keep building. You build and build. But Flora really needed her own story. And she deserved that. And her journey, as much of a roller coaster as Vanessa's was, Flora's is more so.
She's a very interesting character.
She is. She is.
So let's talk about your passion for writing overall. What inspired you to sit down initially to write your first book?
The first novel, the very first book. First novel. A creative writing class.
Okay.
With a phenomenal teacher.
I remember that.
And you know what's peculiar about that is there are teachers and they're teachers. Not everyone can teach courses in creativity, and you've got to be very careful, because if you get the wrong teacher in a creative course, they'll mess you up.
Okay.
I've seen that. I've seen that.
You were inspired to pen your first book based on your experience and what you learned
based
in the
on a homework
class.
assignment. A homework assignment. There were several things from which to choose, and I chose the option of writing a scene in which sex was or was not the inevitable outcome. First 2 chapters of Vanessa love story. Didn't know that was going to happen, but it happened. And the strange thing about that, when the scene came together where there was a turning point, are they going to have sex or not? I didn't know how to write a sex scene, and I was scared to death, and I didn't know what to say. And so I remember saying, time stopped on the wall, and then I went on to the next scene, and one of the men in class tore me a new one. He said, you cannot stop there. You just cannot stop there. And I thought to myself, and so eventually, before the book went on, I said, okay, if you're going to write a love scene, you're just going to have to dive in and just do it.
Yeah,
and not be afraid to do it.
And I've talked to a lot of different novelists about sex in their books and how far to take it, and or just to kind of give the reader the sense that it happened. And many times they say, well, how important is it to the story? So if it's a story about someone being unfaithful, then making it as hot as possible is probably not a bad thing. But if it's something that isn't very critical or pivotal to the overall story, I mean, you can still make it hot and steamy if you want, but you really want to focus on the story and not so much the scene and that was advice that was given to me, like how far do you go, and the basis being how important is it to the story. But I don't want to get too far from talking about your passion for writing, which is what I really want to focus on. So you started writing your first novel and finishing it based on that experience in the writer's class. And